There are two ways to start a good day for Richard Kirwan. A sunrise over his home city of Waterford and tucking his pants into his socks. Richard is retired now, but there's a connection between his daily cycles around Waterford and his old job. He was an engineer in charge of the Ordnance Survey. However, in retirement, he's also doing something very un-engineer-like. Richard grew up in this house in Cannon Street. Across the street is what he calls an omen to his future career. A benchmark placed by mapping surveyors in the 1800s. And in his childhood bedroom was another omen.
I remember going through one of the presses in my bedroom, and I found a coloured map of Waterford and the surrounding areas. And I became fascinated because it showed this city as I had never seen it. It showed it obviously almost from the air. It was a very attractive map. It was almost artistic in its depiction of the landscape. Here you can see the hashing on the hills, the green for the trees, the rivers. You had the sea as well, and the blue near the coast fading into, the white of the map.
But these maps aren't just made from paper. For Richard, they were sensory. The smells, sounds and feel of childhood Sundays.
Shortly after that we would turn right and go right across towards Powers and Knox.
Because every week, Richard's father and grandfather would bring him out cycling around the city and countryside.
The Knockeen Dolmen, we'd often stop here and just wander in and explore the monument.
Were you not bored as a young fellow going out with the two older men?
No, because as they passed through each townland, they sang off the name of the townland and told me where I was, and they would know people that would have lived in those townlands, and so they'd be sort of nattering away to themselves about various people that lived there, and I'd be listening in and enjoying it. Never knew I was taking much in at the time, but it obviously left a pretty lasting impression.
The Sunday cycles had a soundtrack. Everywhere Richard and his father and grandfather stopped, there were stories.
We were passing along here and he started to tell me about the time when he was young. He was on his way to serve Mass one morning. As he went along a narrow road, he met two men carrying a coffin on their shoulders, and he couldn't quite understand it. And he found out that the men were carrying the coffin of what would have been known at the time as a land grabber. That people had been evicted from their land and this person had taken it over. And when he died, nobody would handle his body or the coffin. I remember asking him, if the priest would have said a prayer at the graveside or anything, and I got absolutely no reply from him.
When he left school, Richard became an engineer and joined the Ordnance Survey, which at the time was run by the military. Working for the Ordnance Survey in the 1970s, it was pre-computer, pre-satellite, and you had to get out in the field.
We used to have to carry 12-volt batteries up mountains, and these were heavy-duty lorry batteries, not car batteries. We had to build what we called trig pillars on the tops of hills, and very often you had to lug, sand and cement on your back up the hills because there was no other way of getting it up there. A horse or an ass couldn't bring it up. So, there were the hardships there, but they were sort of enjoyable hardships, maybe not enjoyable on the day.
Richard was enthusiastic about mapping. It fixed the landscape in time with rigour and precision. But as if he had forgotten his childhood cycles, he thought that that was all there was to it. But he soon found out there was more. In order to survey, you had to go into farmhouses to get permission to access the land, and he would bring the old maps of the area with him, and as soon as he opened them out, the stories would start.
Not alone would they say who the neighbour was and what happened to them, or whether they were alive or dead. They might start naming the fields that were around them, and say, oh yeah, look, there's the Haggard field there, or there's the field with the big tree. It was almost as if these fields had disappeared for generations, and suddenly they were appearing back to them again, because there was always an air of excitement when they would look and say, oh yeah, there's the Haggard field. Yeah, as if it shouldn't be there, but it was an amazing thing just to listen, because you wouldn't have to say anything, other than say, sometimes you'd have to say, well, look, you're here, and point out a few little bits and pieces, and once they got the bearings, you could just stay quiet, say nothing, and they would be off, and you could just listen and listen and listen.
The cemetery at Risk near Waterford City. Another stop for Richard and his father and grandfather on their Sunday cycles. This cemetery used to be a hideout during the War of Independence. Stopping here one Sunday prompted a story from Richard's grandfather.
And he started to relate to me a story about his mother, who had been a runner for the IRA in the 1920s. She used to go on an Aston cart to pay the men on the run. And, if the British Army or the Black and Tans, whoever were there at the time, would stop her, she was a woman coming home from the market with something in her basket.
Richard's time in Ordnance Survey coincided with the arrival of aerial photography and computerisation. The maps were more precise, but not as beautiful. Although his childhood interests pointed to a job in the Ordnance Survey, the work was very far removed from that time, until one day a childhood memory flooded back and caused him to break down.
I was pretty stressed, let's say. I couldn't see it, but I'm sure they saw it at home as well.
Richard's boss recommended that he go on a training course, which included a session of hypnosis.
And when I was in a trance, something happened, because when I sort of came out of that trance, that hypnosis trance, I just felt that things had changed totally, and I began to wonder, about the life I was living, whether, in fact, it was all work and no play, which it was, because at that time I wasn't taking holidays. I was very, very, very emotional. I think one of the things that came up for me was the whole issue of my own father's death, because, as you can gather from talking to you, I was quite attached to my father, and he died when I was 13, died suddenly. And I never cried when my father died. And I remember the night he died, he was out and he never came back. And I heard a commotion downstairs, probably. I was still awake, I wasn't a great sleeper. But I was still awake, it could have been 11, 12 at night time. And next minute there was a knock on my bedroom door, and an aunt came in. And she told me, sat in the bed and said, your father was dead. And she said, you're the man of the house, you can't cry. And I didn't cry.
One thing led to another, and Richard decided that work was taking up too much of his time. He explored other paths and discovered that he was interested in healing. But you're an engineer, so how do you make sense of something like Reiki healing?
I don't anymore. Whereas I can see the logic of making maps. This is just an intuitive thing. A number of years ago, I certainly would have absolutely scoffed at it. But I think something in me said, let it happen. And I let it happen. And as I say, I don't make any claims. I don't practice, an awful lot. I practice on family and friends and people that want to do that. But I make no claims, and I never try to explain it.
As well as occasionally healing, Richard also writes. As Richard cycles the Sunday routes around Waterford taken by his father and grandfather, he is now the older man on the bike, with the names of places and their stories.
Approximately here We're on the site of what would have been known as Bridgie Walsh's. She sold single cigarettes to schoolboys and single matches. And the trick was that you bought a single cigarette and then divided it in two and sold half it to your friend, or gave half it to your friend. And you were allowed to smoke in Bridges. She had a sort of a wooden, I just about call it a bench there. But beside the wooden bench, she had a paraffin oil tank from which you sell paraffin oil, and the shop reeked of paraffin. So that, and she didn't see any difficulty, you know, with schoolboys lighting matches, smoking cigarettes beside this sort of time bomb of paraffin oil.